Everyone's heard of radio silence, but almost no one has heard of radio deception. For years, the inner workings of Allied signals intelligence were a complete mystery, hidden behind layers of classification so thick, not even historians could cut through them. No transcripts, no codebooks, just rumors until now. What you're about to hear is the real story of how the Allies built entirely fake communication networks, staffed by real operators, broadcasting on real frequencies, all to feed the German military a diet of carefully crafted lies. And they said it couldn't be done. To be fair, they were mostly right to be skeptical, because this wasn't just about sending a false message here or there. This was about constructing a fictional army, a fictional air force, a fictional chain of command, and then making it breathe. Making it sound real. Making German intelligence officers on the other end of those receivers believe, completely and without question, that they were listening to something that existed. This is the story of the men and women who built the most elaborate lie in military history. And it starts not with a general, not with a politician, but with a single radio operator sitting in a cold tent somewhere in southern England, tapping out a message he'd been told to send. A message that was completely false, but tapped in a way that was completely convincing. If you want to understand why the Allies built fake communication networks, you have to first understand how terrifyingly good German signals intelligence had become by 1940. Most people think of World War II intelligence as being primarily about Enigma, about codes, about the brilliant work done at Bletchley Park. And that work was extraordinary. But there was another side to the signals war that gets far less attention, a side that wasn't about breaking codes. It was about listening to the music behind the message. The Germans had developed something called traffic analysis into an art form. And if you've never heard of traffic analysis before, here's what it means. Even if you can't read an encrypted message, you can learn an enormous amount just by watching how messages flow. Who is talking to whom? How often? At what time of day? How long each transmission lasts? What the rhythm of the operator's hand on the Morse key sounds like. All of that information, completely separate from the actual content of the message, told a story. And German signals analysts were extraordinarily good at reading that story. By tracking the volume and pattern of radio traffic coming from a particular unit, they could tell whether that unit was preparing to attack. A sudden surge in communications between a divisional headquarters and its subordinate regiments meant something was happening. A drop in traffic from a sector that had been busy for weeks might mean the unit had moved, or been destroyed, or pulled back. The Germans called this Funkaufklärung, which translates roughly as radio reconnaissance. And by the time the war in North Africa started, their Funkaufklärung units had become so skilled that they were sometimes predicting Allied movements before the Allies had finished planning them. There was a German unit called the Horch Company, which means listening company, and another specialist formation that operated across the North African front, analyzing Allied radio patterns. Their reports were being read at the highest levels of the Wehrmacht. Rommel himself reportedly relied on signals intelligence assessments when deciding where and when to commit his armored forces. And the Allies knew it. They knew the Germans were listening, not just to the content of their messages, but to the shape of their communications. The volume, the timing, the frequency, the feel of it, which meant that any attempt to deceive the Germans about Allied intentions couldn't just involve changed plans on a map. It had to involve changed radio behavior across the entire theater of operations. The deception had to be transmitted. It had to be broadcast. And it had to be broadcast convincingly enough that trained German signals analysts, men who had spent years developing an intuitive feel for the electronic pulse of an army, would believe it completely. That was the challenge, and it was genuinely enormous. The first serious Allied attempt to wrestle with this problem came in the Western Desert in 1941 and 1942. The situation in North Africa was desperate. Rommel's Afrika Korps had proven itself one of the most tactically brilliant fighting forces in the world. British and Commonwealth forces had suffered a string of humiliating defeats. And at a higher command level, there was a growing awareness that German signals intelligence was a major contributing factor to those defeats. The man who began to formulate a serious response was a British officer named Dudley Clark, who ran a deception organization called a Force. Clark was one of the most creative military minds of the war. He understood instinctively that deception was not simply about telling lies, it was about constructing an alternative reality so consistent, so detailed, and so internally logical that the target of the deception would choose to believe it. He worked with a team that included some genuinely extraordinary individuals, former stage magicians, con artists, novelists, journalists, people who understood how human beings construct their understanding of reality from fragmentary evidence. And what Clark and Force realized early on was that radio deception had to be a core component of any serious strategic deception plan. You could plant fake documents. You could run double agents. You could construct fake equipment and leave it where German aerial reconnaissance would photograph it. But if the radio traffic didn't match, none of it would work. A German signals analyst looking at the radio pattern of the notional unit you were trying to sell him would immediately notice that something was wrong. The traffic volume would be wrong. The communication patterns between units would be wrong. The timing would be off, and a good analyst would flag it. So the deception had to go all the way down. It had to reach into the technical details of how radio operators behaved, how units communicated, what patterns of traffic a genuine military formation generated in what circumstances. And then it had to replicate all of that, perfectly, using real operators, real equipment, and real transmissions. This is where the concept of special wireless units came into being. These were small, highly specialized teams of radio operators whose job was not to communicate real military information, but to simulate the communications of units that didn't exist. They were actors playing roles in a drama that the Germans believed was real, and the level of detail that went into their performances was staggering. Here's something that most people don't realize about radio operators in the Second World War. Every experienced Morse code operator had what was called a fist, a personal style of tapping out Morse code that was as distinctive as handwriting. The rhythm of how they formed letters, the subtle variations in the length of dots and dashes, the tiny hesitations and flourishes that crept into their transmissions after years of practice, all of it was unique to that individual. And German signals intelligence knew this. They kept records. When they identified a particular operator in a particular unit, they logged that operator's fist. If that operator's signature suddenly appeared somewhere else, the Germans would notice. It told them something. It told them a unit had moved, or that an operator had been transferred, or, if they were lucky, that something was being faked. Because if you put an operator with one fist into a deception unit and had him transmit in a pattern designed to simulate a formation operating somewhere it wasn't, an experienced German analyst might notice that the fist they'd identified as belonging to, say, a signals regiment in Cyprus, was suddenly appearing in transmissions supposedly originating from a location in Syria. And that would blow the deception wide open. So the Allied deception planners had to think about this at a granular level. They had to think about which operators had been monitored by German signals intelligence. They had to think about which operators were unknown to the Germans. They had to manage the deployment of operators with known fists very carefully, making sure those operators appeared where German intelligence expected them to be, while unknown operators were used to populate the fake units. And they had to do all of this while also managing the actual operational signals traffic of real units that were preparing for real attacks. The sheer organizational complexity of it was extraordinary. It was like running two armies simultaneously, one real, one invented, and making sure the invented one was just as convincing as the real one. Let's talk about how a specific deception operation actually worked in practice, because the theory is one thing, but the execution was something else entirely. Operation Bertram was one of the most elaborate deception operations of the North African Campaign, mounted in late 1942 in preparation for the Second Battle of El Alamein. General Bernard Montgomery had taken command of the Eighth Army and was planning a major offensive to smash through Rommel's defensive line. The plan was to attack in the north, at the right time, with overwhelming force. But to do that, he needed to concentrate his armor and his supplies in the north, without the Germans noticing what was being assembled there. At the same time, he needed the Germans to believe that the main attack was going to come from the south. Everything depended on whether the deception held, and the deception involved every tool available. Fake tanks made of wood and canvas disguised as trucks. Real tanks hidden under disguises that made them look like supply vehicles. Hundreds of dummy supply dumps. Fake pipelines built conspicuously in the southern sector to suggest that infrastructure was being prepared there. But all of that physical deception would be meaningless if the radio traffic didn't support it. So a special wireless deception unit was deployed to generate the communications that a real armored formation, preparing to attack from the south, would generate. The operators worked to a script. Not a script in the theatrical sense, but a carefully planned schedule of transmissions that replicated the kind of traffic a genuine headquarters would generate in the weeks leading up to an offensive. Messages about logistics, queries about ammunition supply, routine administrative traffic. the kind of mundane, everyday communication that a real unit generated constantly. And this is a crucial point. Real military radio traffic is not dramatic. It is not full of exciting operational details. The vast majority of it is deeply, profoundly boring. It is about rations, and vehicle maintenance, and personnel returns, and 1,000 other tedious administrative matters. And that boredom was part of the authenticity. A German analyst listening to the traffic coming from what he believed was an armored division preparing to attack in the south would hear exactly the kind of dull, procedural communications that a genuine division generated. And that ordinariness made it convincing. Meanwhile, in the north, where the real attack was being prepared, genuine signals traffic was being suppressed as much as possible. Real units communicated by telephone wire rather than radio wherever they could. Messages were delivered by courier. Commanders held briefings in person rather than on the radio. The electronic silence of the North was as deliberately constructed as the electronic noise of the South. And when the attack finally came, in the early hours of October 23, 1942, the German positions were in exactly the wrong state of readiness. Rommel himself was in Germany, on medical leave, because German intelligence had assessed that no major British offensive was imminent. He had to be hastily recalled when the barrage began. The deception had worked. At every level, in the physical world and in the electronic world. And signals deception had been a core component of why it worked. But El Alamein, as significant as it was not the apex of Allied radio deception. That came later, much later, and on a much larger scale. By 1943, the Allies were planning operations of a scope that dwarfed anything attempted in the desert. The invasion of Sicily, the invasion of Italy, and ultimately, the invasion of France. Each of these operations required deception plans that were more complex than anything previously attempted, and each of those deception plans required signals components that had to be planned and executed with absolute precision. For the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, the Allies ran Operation Mincemeat, in which the body of a dead man was dressed in the uniform of a British officer and allowed to wash ashore in Spain, carrying fake documents suggesting that the invasion target was not Sicily, but Greece and Sardinia. This is one of the most famous deception operations of the war, but what is less well known is the signals component that supported it, because floating a body with documents was not enough on its own. If German intelligence looked at the radio traffic patterns in the Mediterranean and saw a massive buildup of communications consistent with preparations for an assault on Sicily, and nothing to suggest any activity related to Greece or Sardinia, then the documents wouldn't be believed. The physical deception and the electronic deception had to tell the same story, so alongside the physical deception, signals units generated traffic, suggesting that preparations were underway in the eastern Mediterranean. Communications consistent with the logistical buildup for an operation against Greece. Traffic that, when analyzed by German signals intelligence, would reinforce the story told by the documents found on the body. The two deceptions supported each other. Each one made the other more believable. And together they helped convince the Germans that Sicily was a feint and that the real target lay elsewhere. When Allied troops landed on Sicily's beaches, the German High Command initially held back forces because they were waiting for the real invasion to begin. The one the documents and the radio traffic had told them was coming. The extra hours and days that hesitation bought the Allies were measured in lives, in ground taken, in the relative ease of a landing that could have been catastrophically costly. All of it, at least in part, a consequence of radio deception. Now we need to talk about the people who actually did this work, because it is easy to describe deception operations in terms of plans and outcomes, and to forget that those plans were executed by human beings who were working under extraordinary pressure with very limited resources and very high stakes. The signals deception units that operated throughout the Mediterranean and later in northwestern Europe were staffed largely by volunteers who had been selected for a combination of technical skill and personal qualities that made them suitable for highly specialized, often highly stressful work. Many of them were civilian radio operators who had been drafted and had attracted attention during their training for exceptional proficiency or for some particular quality that their instructors thought might make them suitable for something unusual. They were told very little about the broader context of what they were doing. Operational security demanded that information be compartmentalized. An operator in a deception unit knew that he was sending false traffic. He knew the general nature of the deception he was supporting. But he almost certainly did not know the full scope of the plan he was part of, or how his transmissions fit into the larger strategic picture. And there was another dimension to this that deserves attention, the psychological dimension, because operating in a deception unit meant living in a kind of elaborate fiction. You maintained a persona. You transmitted as if you were part of a unit that didn't exist. You developed a routine that mimicked the routine of a real military headquarters. You sent messages about supply problems that weren't real, about personnel issues in a unit that had no personnel, about equipment that existed only on paper. And you had to do all of this with enough consistency and enough conviction that a trained professional on the other end of your transmissions would never suspect that you were an actor. The stress of that, particularly in the early days before the techniques had been fully refined, was considerable. There was always the fear that you'd made a mistake, that you'd deviated from the pattern in some subtle way that a German analyst would notice, that a single slip in the timing of a transmission, a single message that didn't quite fit the pattern of what a real unit would send, might unravel everything. The officers who commanded these units spent enormous amounts of time on quality control, on reviewing transcripts of transmissions and looking for any deviation from what was expected, on debriefing operators after each session to check whether anything unusual had occurred, on maintaining what amounted to an internal editorial function over the entire output of the deception. They were, in a very real sense, not just military officers but writers and directors of a very peculiar kind of drama, one in which the audience was the enemy, and the audience's suspension of disbelief was the entire point. By 1943, the Allied approach to signals deception had been refined and formalized into something approaching a doctrine, a set of principles and procedures that could be applied consistently across multiple theaters and multiple operations. The core of this doctrine rested on several key insights that had been developed through hard experience. The first was that deception had to be consistent across all dimensions simultaneously. It was not enough to generate convincing radio traffic if the physical evidence didn't match. It was not enough to plant convincing documents if the signal's traffic told a different story. Every piece of evidence that reached German intelligence had to support the same narrative. Everything had to be consistent. Everything had to cohere. The second insight was that the most convincing deceptions were those that required the least invention. If you wanted to convince the Germans that you had an armored division in a particular location, the easiest way to do it was to take a real armored division that had genuinely been in that location recently, tell the Germans, through various channels, that it had not moved, and then actually move it somewhere else while leaving behind enough signals traffic to suggest it was still there. The unit's history was real. The German intelligence files on it were real. The operators who had transmitted for it were known. The only thing that was false was its current location. And that made the deception far more robust than one that required building a fictional unit from scratch. The third insight was about tempo. Real military units did not generate traffic at a constant rate. Their communications surged and slackened with the rhythm of military life. When a unit was preparing for operations, its traffic volume increased. When it was in a quiet period, traffic decreased. When it moved, there was a brief disruption in its communication patterns, followed by a re-establishment of contact from a new location. All of these rhythms had to be replicated by deception units with careful precision. A deception unit that generated traffic at too constant a rate would immediately strike a trained analyst as suspicious. Real units didn't work like that. Their communications breathed, and the deception had to breathe too. These principles were applied with increasing sophistication as the war went on, but nowhere were they applied on a larger scale or with greater consequence than in the preparations for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The deception plan supporting Overlord was called Operation Bodyguard, and within Bodyguard, the signals component was so vast and so intricate that it almost defies comprehension. The central fiction that Bodyguard was trying to sell the Germans was that the Normandy landings, when they came, were a diversion. That the real invasion would follow shortly afterward at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, the location closest to Germany, the location that any rational strategic planner would identify as the most logical invasion point. To make the Germans believe this, the Allies had to convince them of the existence of an entirely fictional army group. This was FUSOG, the first United States Army Group. On paper, FUSOG was the largest concentration of American military power ever assembled in Britain. It was supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton, the most aggressive and feared American commander in the German military's estimation. It was supposedly equipped and trained and positioned to strike at the Pas de Calais at any moment. And it was entirely fictional. Not entirely, actually. It had a headquarters that was real. It had some real units assigned to it on paper, but the vast bulk of its supposed combat power, the dozens of divisions that the Germans believed were waiting to cross the Channel and smash into the Pas-de-Calais, those divisions existed only in German intelligence files. They had been built up over months, through a combination of double-agent reports, fake documents, carefully managed aerial reconnaissance bait, and radio traffic. Enormous volumes of radio traffic. The signals apparatus constructed to give FUSOG an electronic presence was the largest signals deception operation ever mounted. Across southern and eastern England, deception wireless units generated the communications of a massive army group preparing for the most significant operation of the war. They simulated the traffic of corps and divisional headquarters that didn't exist. They generated the administrative communications of supply depots that weren't there. They transmitted the routine traffic of signals regiments, engineering units, artillery formations, all the supporting elements that a genuine army group would require. And they did it at a volume that matched what German signals intelligence expected from a formation of FUSOG's supposed size. The scale of this operation was extraordinary. At its peak, dozens of separate deception transmitter sites were operating simultaneously, each one contributing to the electronic portrait of an army group that existed only in the imaginations of the people creating it and the intelligence files of the people being deceived. The operators working these sites were professional and disciplined. But they were under constant pressure to maintain perfect consistency. Any deviation from the expected pattern, any message that didn't quite fit the established rhythm of the unit being simulated, any slip in the timing or the volume of transmissions, could potentially alert a sharp-eyed German analyst that something was wrong. The oversight of this operation required a dedicated coordination staff whose entire job was to ensure that the electronic picture being presented to German intelligence was internally consistent and plausible at every moment. They maintained detailed logs of every transmission from every deception site. They tracked the patterns of traffic to ensure they matched what a genuine unit of the size and type being simulated would generate. They reviewed German signals intelligence assessments, which were sometimes available to the Allies through intelligence channels, to see whether the Germans were buying what they were being sold. And they adjusted the transmissions accordingly. If German analysis suggested that a particular unit was being assessed as at a lower strength than intended, the traffic volume might be quietly increased. If there was any sign that a particular deception site was attracting suspicion, its transmissions would be adjusted or its schedule modified. It was a dynamic process, a continuous process of performance and adjustment, a living deception that had to be maintained day after day, week after week, month after month. And at the center of all of this was a man whose name most people have never heard, but who deserves to be far better known than he is. His name was Roger Hesketh, and he was the officer primarily responsible for planning and coordinating the signals aspects of the bodyguard deception. Hesketh was an unusual figure, a wealthy English barrister by background, with no military experience before the war. But he had a mind of exceptional precision and clarity, and he understood the importance of detail in a way that was absolutely essential to the work he was doing. He understood that the deception was only as strong as its weakest component, that a single inconsistency, a single message that didn't quite fit, could potentially unravel everything that had been so carefully constructed. He drove his staff relentlessly in pursuit of that consistency. There is a story told about Hesketh, probably apocryphal but instructive, in which a junior officer brought him a draft transmission schedule for one of the FUSOG deception units, and Hesketh reviewed it, put it down, and said something to the effect of, "This unit is supposedly a divisional signals regiment that has been in its current location for 3 weeks. Why is it still using the communication procedures it would have used on the first day of occupation?" By 3 weeks, they would have established proper landlines for internal communications, and they would only be using radio for specified purposes. The traffic pattern you've given me looks like a unit that just arrived. Do it again. That level of attention to detail, that insistence on authenticity, in the smallest particulars, was the foundation on which the entire deception rested. And it worked. By June 1944, German intelligence had built up what they believed was a comprehensive picture of Allied forces in Britain. They believed that the 1st United States Army Group, with its dozens of divisions, was poised to strike at the Pas-de-Calais. They believed that the Normandy landings, when they came, were secondary, a diversion designed to draw German reserves south and west before the real blow fell in the north. And that belief, maintained in significant part by the signals deception operation, had profound consequences for the battle that followed. When Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the German High Command faced an agonizing decision. Should they commit the panzer reserves held back to defend against the expected Pas-de-Calais landing, or should they send them to Normandy to throw the Allies back into the sea before the beachhead could be consolidated? The debate raged for days. Hitler himself, who had become convinced that Normandy was a diversion, refused to release the panzer reserves. The forces that might have crushed the Normandy beachhead in its first critical days were held back, waiting for an attack that was never going to come. By the time it became clear to German intelligence that Fusag was a fiction and that the real invasion was Normandy, it was too late. The beachhead was established. The breakout was coming. The war in the West had been decisively shaped by a deception, and a crucial component of that deception had been played out on radio frequencies across the south and east of England, by small teams of operators sitting in fields and farmhouses, tapping out messages for an army that didn't exist. But here's the thing about Operation Bodyguard and the signals deception component of Fusag that deserves more careful attention than it usually receives. The radio deception wasn't just about volume. It wasn't just about generating enough traffic to make the Germans think there was a large force there. It was about something much more subtle and much more interesting. It was about the internal logic of military communications. When a real army group operated, its communications had a structure. Information flowed up and down the hierarchy in predictable ways. A divisional headquarters communicated with its brigade headquarters in certain ways at certain times. A corps headquarters communicated with its divisions in patterns that reflected the way military command actually worked. Requests for information flowed in one direction. Orders flowed in another. Administrative queries went to the appropriate staff branches. Operational information was handled with specific security procedures. All of this structure had to be replicated in the deception. Not just the volume of traffic, but the shape of it, the hierarchy of it. The way information moved through a fictional organization had to mirror precisely the way information moved through a real organization of the same type and size. And that required the deception planners to have an intimate understanding of how military communications actually worked at every level of command. They had to know not just that a divisional headquarters communicated with its brigades, but how it communicated with them, and about what, and when, and in what format. They had to know the difference between the communication patterns of an armored division and an infantry division, because those differences were real, and a skilled German analyst might notice them. They had to know how a headquarters preparing for an offensive operation changed its communications behavior in the days and weeks leading up to the attack, because German analysts had been watching those patterns for years and knew them well. In short, the deception required a level of operational expertise that went far beyond simple radio operating skill. The people planning the deception traffic had to understand military operations as thoroughly as the people planning the actual military operations. And in many cases they did, because the deception planning staffs were populated with officers who had served in operational roles and who could bring that experience to bear on the task of constructing convincing fictional military behavior. One of the most remarkable aspects of this work was the attention given to what might be called negative space in communications, the things that a unit didn't transmit. Because real military units did not generate traffic about everything they did. Some things were handled on secure landlines. Some things were handled by courier. Some things were handled face-to-face. The decision about what to put on the radio and what not to put on the radio was itself a form of security discipline, and a deception unit had to replicate that decision process convincingly. If the fictional unit was supposed to have secure landline communications between its headquarters and one of its subordinate formations, then there should be very little radio traffic between those two nodes, because they'd be using the landline. But the absence of radio traffic between two headquarters that were supposedly in constant contact would only be convincing if the Germans believed there was a landline connection, and convincing them of that required that the existence of the landline be communicated somehow, perhaps through a brief administrative message, perhaps through a reference in other traffic. Every silence had to be as carefully engineered as every transmission. This is what distinguished the best signals deception work from merely adequate signals deception work. Anyone could generate a lot of radio traffic and hope it was convincing. The real art was in generating exactly the right amount of traffic, of exactly the right type, at exactly the right times, with exactly the right silences in between, and then doing it all again the next day, and the day after that, month after month, for as long as the deception needed to be maintained. Now let's talk about the double agents, because no account of Allied radio deception in the Second World War can be complete without them. The relationship between human intelligence and signals intelligence in the context of deception was intimate and mutually reinforcing. The most important of these double agents in the context of the Fusag deception was a Spaniard known by the codename Garbo. His real name was Juan Pujol Garcia, and his story is one of the most extraordinary in the history of intelligence. Pujol had approached British intelligence before the war and offered his services as a spy against the Nazis. He was turned down. Undeterred, he contacted the Germans and persuaded them that he was a willing agent. He then traveled, supposedly, to Britain, where he began sending reports to his German handlers about British military preparations. In fact, he was living in Lisbon, sending fictional reports based on publicly available information and his own considerable imagination. Eventually, British intelligence discovered what he was doing, made contact with him, and brought him properly into the fold. He was relocated to Britain and given a team of MI5 handlers who worked with him to develop and manage his network of fictional sub-agents. By 1944, the Germans believed that Garbo was running the most productive intelligence network in Britain, a network of dozens of agents spread across the country, each one providing information about military preparations, troop movements, and strategic intentions. Every single one of those agents was fictional, and a significant part of what they reported to their German handlers was the existence and disposition of Fusag, the fictional divisions, the fictional headquarters, the preparations for the fictional attack on the Pas de Calais. And this is where the signals deception and the human intelligence deception became inseparable, because when German intelligence received a report from Garbo about a particular formation, they could cross-check it against their signals intelligence assessments. If Garbo said there was an armored division at a particular location in eastern England, and German signals intelligence was picking up communications consistent with an armored division at that location, then the two intelligence streams were corroborating each other. Each one made the other more credible. Each one reinforced the picture that the Germans were building of Allied forces in Britain. The Germans were not stupid. Their intelligence analysts were professional and experienced. They did not simply accept everything they were told. They cross-referenced reports from different sources and looked for consistency. They looked for corroboration, and the genius of the Allied deception was that the corroboration was there, not by accident, but by design. The double agent reports and the signals traffic had been carefully synchronized to tell the same story. Garbo's fictional agents reported what they would logically have seen if Fusag had been real. And the signals deception units generated the traffic that a real Fusag would have generated. The two streams of evidence pointed in the same direction, and German intelligence, looking for corroboration and finding it everywhere they looked, concluded that the evidence was solid, that Fusag was real, that the Pas de Calais was the target, and held that belief even after the Normandy landings had begun. The most important single transmission in this entire deception came on the night of June 9, 1944, 3 days after D-Day. Garbo sent a message to his German handlers arguing that the Normandy landings were a diversion and that the main attack was still coming at the Pas de Calais. This was a message that had been carefully prepared by Garbo's MI5 handlers in coordination with the broader deception planning staff. It was time to reach the Germans at a moment when they were debating whether to commit their reserves to Normandy. And it worked. A German intelligence assessment based in significant part on Garbo's message was passed to Hitler. And Hitler, already predisposed to believe that Normandy was a feint, accepted it. The Panzer reserves stayed where they were. The moment when they might have driven the Allies back into the sea passed. And the deception, supported by months of carefully constructed radio traffic, had achieved its strategic purpose. Now, there is another dimension of the signals deception story that is often overlooked, and it concerns not the grand strategic operations in Britain and the Mediterranean, but the more tactical uses of radio deception in specific battlefield contexts. Because while the large-scale strategic deceptions get most of the attention, there was a parallel and equally sophisticated tradition of using radio deception at the operational and tactical level, in ways that were just as ingenious and often just as consequential. One of the most interesting examples of this comes from the Pacific Theater, where the challenge of radio deception was in some ways even more complex than in Europe. In the Pacific, the Japanese signals intelligence services were highly capable and deeply experienced. They had been monitoring American communications since before the war and had developed a sophisticated picture of American communication practices and procedures. But they had one significant vulnerability: the same vulnerability that the Germans in Europe had in common with them. They relied heavily on traffic analysis, on the patterns of communications rather than just the content of messages. And American deception planners in the Pacific learned to exploit this vulnerability in creative ways. Before the invasion of Iwo Jima in February 1945, American signals units generated traffic patterns designed to suggest that the attack would fall on a different island entirely. Before the Philippines campaign, similar techniques were used to create uncertainty about the actual landing point. The traffic patterns of units that were secretly being concentrated for specific operations were masked by deception traffic generated elsewhere. The operational security of major amphibious operations depended in significant part on these radio deception efforts. And in the Pacific, where amphibious operations were the dominant form of offensive action, radio deception became an integral part of operational planning in a way that it arguably was in no other theater. But there's a story from the Pacific that deserves special attention because it illustrates the level of creativity and boldness that characterize the best signals deception work. Before the landings at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, American deception planners developed a plan to confuse Japanese intelligence about the timing and direction of the coming attack. They created what amounted to a phantom fleet, not physical ships but an electronic signature of a fleet that didn't exist. Radio operators aboard real ships and at shore stations generated the traffic patterns of a substantial naval force that was supposedly operating in a different area from the actual invasion fleet. The Japanese, tracking American radio traffic, picked up the signature of this phantom force and factored it into their assessments of American intentions. The uncertainty that this created was a contribution to the broader disorientation that characterized Japanese strategic decision-making in the crucial days before and during the Leyte Gulf battle. The actual Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval engagement in history, and though the outcome was determined by many factors, the confusion that radio deception had seeded in Japanese intelligence planning in the days beforehand played its part in the Allied victory. Back in Europe, as the war entered its final phase in 1944 and 1945, the signals deception apparatus that had been so carefully built up was turned to new purposes. As the Allies advanced across France and into Germany, the challenge shifted from concealing a forthcoming offensive to something subtler and in some ways more difficult. The challenge was to maintain operational surprise in a fluid, rapidly moving campaign where the front lines were changing daily and German intelligence was struggling to maintain any coherent picture of Allied dispositions. In this context, signals deception took on a more dynamic character. Rather than maintaining a static fiction over a long period, deception units now had to be responsive to the immediate tactical situation, generating traffic that supported the operational deceptions that frontline commanders were running on a daily basis. If a division was planning to swing north to envelop a German position, the deception unit might generate traffic suggesting continued pressure from the south. If a corps was preparing to cross a river at one point, deception traffic might suggest that the crossing was being prepared at a different location. This tactical flexibility required operators and their commanders to be much more agile than they had been in the relatively static conditions of the pre-Overlord period. They had to understand the operational situation well enough to generate convincing traffic that supported whatever deception the operational commander was running. They had to be able to shift their performance on short notice, and they had to maintain the quality of their transmissions under the pressures of a rapidly moving campaign, which was significantly more demanding than operating from a fixed location in southern England. The men and women who did this work in the final year of the war deserve recognition for a quality that is often overlooked in accounts of intelligence work. They deserve recognition for improvisation, for the ability to be creative under pressure, for the capacity to take the principles and techniques they had developed in more leisurely circumstances and apply them effectively in conditions that those principles and techniques had never been designed for. As the German military collapsed in the spring of 1945, and as the signals intelligence resources of the Wehrmacht were destroyed or captured, the need for signals deception faded. The German ability to monitor Allied communications, to run traffic analysis, to make assessments based on the electronic picture of Allied forces, had been progressively degraded by the fighting and by the collapse of the institutional structures that had made those assessments possible. But before that collapse, German signals intelligence had been fed a steady diet of carefully constructed lies for the better part of 4 years, lies that had shaped the course of campaigns, that had contributed to the success of landings that could have ended in catastrophe, that had held German reserves in the wrong place at the wrong moment. That had helped win battles that might otherwise have been lost. The full extent of what signals deception contributed to Allied victory will never be precisely quantifiable. Historians can point to specific moments, Alamein, the Sicily invasion, Normandy, where the contribution was clearly significant. But the cumulative effect of years of systematic deception, the way it eroded German confidence in their own intelligence assessments, the way it created a persistent uncertainty about Allied intentions that forced the Germans to hedge their dispositions and keep reserves in the wrong places, that cumulative effect is much harder to measure. But it was real, and it mattered. After the war, the men and women who had worked in signals deception returned to civilian life in almost total obscurity. The work they had done was classified for decades. They couldn't talk about it. They couldn't write about it. And so for many years, their contribution went unrecognized. The story of Bletchley Park eventually came out, and those codebreakers received a measure of the recognition they deserved. But the signals deception operators, the people who had sat in fields and farmhouses sending false messages for armies that didn't exist, they remained in the shadows for much longer. It was only with the gradual declassification of wartime documents from the 1970s onward that the full picture began to emerge. And even now, the story is not as widely known as it should be. The names of the key figures in signals deception, the technical details of how the operations worked, the specific contributions that those operations made to specific battles, all of this deserves to be far better known than it is. Because what these people did was genuinely remarkable. It required a combination of skills and qualities that is unusual in military operations: technical proficiency, psychological insight, attention to detail, creative intelligence, the ability to maintain a sustained performance under pressure. And above all, a kind of professional modesty, a willingness to do essential work that no one would ever publicly acknowledge or reward. They were, in the most literal sense, the invisible soldiers of the Second World War, the people whose work shaped battles and campaigns, but whose names appeared in no dispatches, and whose contributions earned no medals. Let's take a moment to talk about what all of this tells us about the nature of deception itself, because the Allied signals deception operations of the Second World War illuminate some fundamental truths about how deception works that go well beyond the specific historical context. The first truth is that the most effective deceptions are those that respect the intelligence of the target. The worst kind of deception is one that depends on the enemy being stupid. That's not deception. That's wishful thinking. The Germans were not stupid. Their signals intelligence analysts were professional and capable. The Allied deception planners knew this and designed their operations accordingly. They didn't try to do anything so blatant or so simple that an intelligent analyst would immediately see through it.